Malibu basked in its usual brilliance that evening. Waves gently lapped against the shore, their rhythm as consistent as the wealth and elegance of the residents who called this place home. Among them, Andrew Luster and his wife Emily were considered royalty, heirs to fortune, inhabitants of an oceanfront estate, and seemingly blessed with a life few could dream of. Yet, in the midst of perfection, shadows quietly loomed. The evening gala at the exclusive Malibu Country Club was bustling with conversation and laughter. Guests sipped champagne, their reflections glinting off crystal glasses as chandeliers cast warm light over the crowd. Andrew, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, moved effortlessly among them, his charm an unspoken currency. But his attention wavered as his eyes searched for Emily. Across the room she stood by the piano, radiant in a flowing emerald gown. Her laughter, light and melodious, drifted over the room, yet something about her demeanor unsettled him. She seemed distant, more engaged in conversation with her circle than in sharing a glance with him. "Andrew, darling, you've outdone yourself again," a woman cooed, drawing his attention back. He smiled politely, but his thoughts remained with Emily. The gala had been her idea, a chance to reconnect, she had said. But tonight she felt farther away than ever. As he moved closer to her, snippets of a conversation reached his ears, enough to stop him mid-step. "The surfer boy? Oh, I've seen them together." The words were casual, cloaked in laughter, but they hit Andrew like a sharp gust of wind. He turned slightly, catching sight of two women whispering behind their flutes of champagne. One noticed his gaze and quickly turned away, feigning interest in her drink. Andrew's jaw tightened. Gossip was common in their circles, often harmless, but this felt different, pointed, personal. Still, he brushed it off. Emily adored him. She always had. Hadn't she? Later that evening, as the guests danced beneath the stars, Andrew finally managed to draw Emily aside. "You've been elusive tonight," he said with a strained smile. "Have I?" Her voice was light, but her eyes avoided his. "Just busy entertaining." "Entertaining who?" he pressed, his tone sharper than intended. She hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Everyone, Andrew. You know how these events are." She kissed his cheek quickly, a perfunctory gesture before slipping back into the crowd. He watched her go, unease tightening its grip on him. Andrew had always prided himself on his intuition, his ability to read people, especially Emily. Tonight, something felt off. And then there were those whispers. They gnawed at him, no matter how much he tried to dismiss them. The drive home was silent. Emily stared out the window, the lights of Malibu fading into the distance, while Andrew gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. When they reached the estate, she retreated upstairs with barely a word. Andrew lingered in the foyer, his thoughts racing. Had he imagined the distance between them? The whispered words at the gala? Or was there something more, a crack beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life? Andrew stepped out onto the balcony, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. The waves' steady rhythm usually calmed him, but tonight they seemed to echo his growing doubts. Somewhere, beneath the polished veneer of their life, lay a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. The next morning, Andrew sat alone at the breakfast table, the ocean breeze filtering through the open windows. The remnants of last night's gala clung to his thoughts, each memory replaying in his mind like a persistent wave crashing against the shore. Emily's distant demeanor, the whispered words, her quick departure upstairs. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Emily entered the room, her steps light but hurried. She wore a simple sundress, her hair loosely tied back. "I'm meeting Clara for coffee," she said, avoiding his eyes as she poured herself a glass of orange juice. Andrew frowned. "You didn't mention that earlier." "It was a last-minute thing," she replied, her tone clipped. "Is that a problem?" He opened his mouth to answer, but stopped himself. It wasn't the first time she'd been evasive recently. Over the past few weeks, she'd become increasingly unavailable, vanishing for hours with vague explanations, brushing off his questions with a practiced ease. "No," he said finally, "it's not a problem." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. I'll see you later." Andrew watched her leave, her figure disappearing down the driveway. A part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the woman he'd married was still the same Emily who once looked at him with unwavering adoration. But the seed of doubt planted the night before had taken root, and now it refused to be ignored. The hours stretched on. Emily's absence felt heavier with each passing minute. Andrew wandered through the house, his thoughts a tangled mess. In the study, his gaze fell on a picture frame, Emily's smiling face staring back at him, the two of them on their honeymoon in Maui. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over the glass. When had things changed? Or had he been too preoccupied with his own life to notice? Later that afternoon, Andrew stepped outside to collect the mail. As he returned, he spotted Mrs. Garner, their elderly neighbor, tending to her garden across the street. She straightened when she saw him, her expression warm but laced with curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Garner," Andrew called out. "Andrew, dear," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. "How was the gala last night?" "Lovely," he said, though the word felt hollow. Her eyes sparkled with something unspoken. "I couldn't help but notice Emily's been keeping busy lately. I see her coming and going at the oddest hours. Such a vibrant woman." Andrew stiffened. "Yes, she's very social." Mrs. Garner leaned on her garden hoe, her tone shifting. "You know, women like Emily, they're restless by nature, always seeking something new, something exciting. It's just who they are." Her words landed like a sharp sting. Andrew forced a smile, muttering a polite goodbye before retreating into the house. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding, restless, seeking something new. Was it just idle chatter from an observant neighbor, or was there truth in her remarks? By the time Emily returned home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Andrew sat in the living room, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. He didn't look up as she entered. "You're late," he said evenly. She paused in the doorway. The coffee ran long. Clara wanted to talk about her renovations. His eyes flicked to her. She had always been a skilled liar, so smooth, so effortless. "Of course," he said, the words laced with an edge she couldn't miss. Emily frowned but said nothing. She turned and walked upstairs, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Emily's behavior, Mrs. Garner's comments, the whispers from the gala, all of it swirled together into an undeniable pattern. The cracks in their perfect life were widening, and Andrew couldn't ignore them any longer. The ocean shimmered under the late afternoon sun as Andrew sat parked near the edge of a familiar beach, his car half hidden by the tall grass lining the sandy path. His heart raced and his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, curiosity, suspicion, or was it something deeper, something darker that he wasn't ready to admit? Earlier that day, Emily had mentioned she would be running errands. Her words, casual and dismissive, had only heightened his unease. And now, as he watched the shoreline from a distance, Andrew felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Moments passed, the rhythmic crash of waves blending with the laughter of distant beachgoers. Then he saw her. Emily appeared near the water's edge, her sundress fluttering lightly in the breeze. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a young man, shirtless and tanned, with sun-bleached hair and the easy confidence of someone who belonged to the sea. Jake. Andrew's stomach churned as he watched them. Emily's face lit up in a way he hadn't seen in months. She laughed, freely, openly, her body leaning toward Jake as if drawn to him. And Jake looked at her like she was the only person on the beach. Andrew's breath quickened. He told himself to look away, to leave before the scene unfolding before him shattered whatever was left of his composure. But he couldn't. His eyes stayed fixed on them, on the way Emily touched Jake's arm lightly, on the way Jake leaned closer, his hand brushing her waist. The world around Andrew seemed to fade, the sound of the ocean replaced by the pounding of his heart. This wasn't idle gossip. This wasn't paranoia. It was real. Emily turned suddenly, her gaze sweeping the beach before landing on Andrew's car. For a split second, their eyes met. She froze, her expression a mix of shock and something else, defiance. Jake noticed her change in demeanor and followed her gaze, his brow furrowing as he spotted Andrew. The two men locked eyes, the distance between them doing nothing to dull the intensity of the moment. Andrew felt his chest tighten, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. This wasn't how he'd planned it. He hadn't planned it at all. Emily said something to Jake, something urgent, before walking toward Andrew's car. Jake stayed behind, his posture tense, his eyes never leaving Andrew. Emily reached the car, her movements quick and deliberate. She yanked open the passenger door, leaning in. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "I could ask you the same thing," Andrew shot back, his tone colder than he intended. Her eyes narrowed. "I told you I had errands. Is that what you call this?" He gestured toward Jake, who was still standing by the water, his arms crossed. Emily's face flushed. "I don't have to explain myself to you, Andrew." "Yes, you do." His voice rose, and he noticed Jake take a step closer. "You owe me that much, Emily. You owe me the truth." She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment it looked like she might say something, might confess, but then she straightened, her chin lifting defiantly. "Go home, Andrew. Emily, just go." Without another word, she slammed the door shut and walked away, her strides purposeful as she rejoined Jake. Andrew watched, his hands shaking, as she spoke to him briefly before they disappeared down the shoreline together. Andrew sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, the weight of what he'd just seen settling heavily on his chest. The image of Emily and Jake together burned in his mind, each detail sharpening his growing sense of betrayal. When he finally started the car and drove away, the questions in his head were relentless. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time? Or had he been blind to it all along? But one thought stood out above the rest, dark and unyielding. This wasn't over. The bell above the surf shop door chimed as Andrew pushed it open, his steps deliberate but heavy. The salty tang of the ocean hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of waxed board stacked against the walls. Behind the counter, Jake looked up, his casual demeanor instantly shifting when he recognized Andrew. "Well, this is unexpected," Jake said, leaning back against the counter, his arms crossing over his chest. "What brings you here?" Andrew's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the shop briefly before locking on Jake. "We need to talk," Jake smirked. "About what?" "Don't play dumb," Andrew snapped, his voice low but firm. He took a step closer, his presence looming. "I know what's going on." Jake's smile faltered slightly, but his posture remained relaxed. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Andrew felt his fists clench at his sides, his composure fraying. "I saw you, at the beach, with my wife." Jake's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, nervousness perhaps. "Emily and I are friends, man, that's all." "Friends?" Andrew repeated, his voice rising. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I don't see what's right in front of me?" Jake's expression hardened. "Look, I don't know what Emily's told you, but maybe you should be asking yourself why she's spending time with someone else." The words hit Andrew like a slap, and for a moment the air seemed to leave the room. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged, his tone calm but cutting. "Maybe you're not giving her what she needs. Ever think about that?" Andrew's fists tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. He took another step forward, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Jake didn't back down. "Don't I? Look, man, Emily's her own person. If she's unhappy, maybe that's on you." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Andrew's chest heaved as he tried to rein in the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. He stared at Jake, the younger man's smug expression fueling his anger. But there was something else there, too, an undercurrent of fear that Jake was desperately trying to mask. Andrew took a step back, his voice cold and measured. "This isn't over." Jake's smile faded completely, and for the first time he looked uneasy. "You need to calm down, man. This is getting ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Andrew said, his voice sharp. "You're standing there pretending this is some joke, but you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Andrew didn't wait. He turned on his heel and strode out of the shop, the door slamming shut behind him. Outside, the bright sun and gentle crash of waves felt at odds with the storm raging inside him. Andrew sat in his car for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he replayed the confrontation in his mind. Jake's smugness, his refusal to admit anything, it was infuriating. But it was Emily's role in all of this that cut the deepest. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything they'd built for someone like Jake? By the time Andrew returned home, the tension in his body had transformed into something sharper, something darker. Emily was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She glanced up when he walked in, her expression wary. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Andrew didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, stopping just a few feet from her. "I saw him," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Emily froze, the knife hovering mid-air. "What?" "Jake," Andrew said, his eyes boring into hers. "I saw him. I spoke to him." Her expression shifted, shock, then anger, then something he couldn't quite place. "You had no right." "No right?" Andrew's voice rose, his control slipping. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, humiliating me. And I have no right?" Emily's face flushed as she set the knife down. "You don't understand, Andrew." "Then make me understand," he shot back, his voice trembling with barely restrained rage. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Not this time. The evening air in the Luster household was thick with unspoken tension. Andrew sat in the dimly lit living room, his hands gripping a tumbler of whiskey, the faint clink of ice the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Across the house, Emily moved in and out of rooms, her footsteps soft yet deliberate. Neither had spoken since the confrontation earlier that day, but the weight of their unspoken words hung heavily between them. As the clock struck 9, Emily finally appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed defensively. "Are you planning to sit there all night?" she asked, her tone sharp but weary. Andrew looked up, his gaze piercing. "Depends. Are you planning to lie to me all night?" Emily sighed and walked into the room, sitting on the edge of a nearby chair. "Andrew, we can't keep doing this." "You mean I can't keep asking questions you don't want to answer?" His voice was calm, but the underlying edge was unmistakable. Emily leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "I've told you everything I can. Jake and I—" "Don't," Andrew interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Don't say it like it's some casual thing, like it doesn't mean anything." "It doesn't," Emily snapped back, her voice cracking. "Not in the way you think. He listened to me, Andrew. He was there when you weren't." The words struck Andrew like a blow. He set his glass down with more force than necessary and stood, towering over her. "So, this is my fault now? I've worked my entire life to give you everything, and you repay me by sneaking around with him?" Emily stood as well, her voice rising to match his. "You gave me everything except what I needed. You were too busy with your image, your career, your everything else, to notice that I was drowning." Andrew's face contorted in anger and disbelief. "You think I don't notice? You think I don't see how far you've drifted? But instead of talking to me, you run to Jake? He made me feel seen!" Emily's voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. "For the first time in years, I felt like I mattered." The room fell silent. The only sound, the distant crash of waves against the shore. Andrew stared at her, his chest heaving, his mind racing with emotions he couldn't name. He wanted to yell, to cry, to leave, but instead he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "And what now?" Andrew finally said, his voice eerily calm. "You think you can just walk away? Leave me humiliated, a laughingstock?" Emily flinched but stood her ground. "I don't know what I think, Andrew. I just know I can't keep living like this." Something inside Andrew snapped. He turned away, pacing the room like a caged animal, his thoughts spiraling. Every memory, every promise, every sacrifice he'd made for their life together played in his mind like a cruel joke, and all of it, everything, had led to this moment. "You're not leaving," he said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Emily's eyes widened, a mix of fear and defiance flashing across her face. "You can't stop me." Andrew turned to face her, his expression dark. "Watch me." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't love, Andrew, this is control, and I won't let you control me anymore." Her words hung in the air, sharp and final. Andrew felt his breath catch, his mind reeling. Control? Was that what this was? He didn't know anymore. All he knew was that the woman standing before him, the woman he had built his life around, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Emily turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady despite the tears. Andrew watched her go, his hands trembling, his heart pounding. She paused briefly at the doorway as if she might say something, but then she was gone. Andrew sank into the chair, his head in his hands. The silence of the house pressed down on him heavier than ever before, and for the first time he wondered if this was the beginning of the end, or if the end had already begun. The night was unnaturally still. The usual symphony of Malibu's crashing waves and rustling palms seemed muted, as if the world itself held its breath. Andrew paced the living room, the dim light from the table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His mind raced, the echoes of Emily's words replaying over and over, each one a fresh wound. "This isn't love, Andrew. This is control." He poured another drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass before he downed it in one swift motion. His hand trembled as he set the glass down, the sound of it hitting the table louder than expected in the oppressive silence. Upstairs, the faint creak of a floorboard told him Emily was still awake, though they hadn't spoken since she walked out earlier. Andrew clenched his jaw. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, a relentless tide threatening to break free. He had sacrificed everything for her. His time, his energy, his very identity wrapped up in being the perfect husband. And now she wanted to throw it all away for Jake? He shot a glance at the staircase. The image of Jake's smug face from the surf shop flashed in his mind, reigniting the fire in his chest. No, he wouldn't let this happen. He couldn't. The creak of the stairs startled him, and he turned just as Emily appeared, wrapped in a thin cardigan, her expression unreadable. She stopped a few steps from the bottom, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Can't sleep?" Andrew asked, his voice clipped. Emily hesitated before answering. "I think we need to talk." Andrew let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Now you want to talk? After everything you've done?" Her face hardened. "I haven't done anything you didn't push me toward." That was it. The dam broke. "Push you?" he yelled, his voice echoing through the room. He stepped toward her, his finger pointing accusingly. "Don't you dare put this on me, Emily. You're the one sneaking around lying, humiliating me." Emily didn't flinch. Her voice was quiet but firm. "And you've done nothing wrong, Andrew? You think your suffocating control over every part of my life hasn't pushed me away?" Her words struck like a whip, and Andrew felt his vision blur with rage. He advanced, closing the distance between them. "Do you even hear yourself? You think I don't know what this is really about? It's not about control. It's about him, Jake, isn't it?" Emily's silence was the only confirmation he needed. "You think he loves you?" Andrew spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think he'll be there for you when this all falls apart? He's using you, Emily, and you're too blind to see it." "Enough!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped back. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Yes, I am," Emily said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is over." Something inside Andrew snapped. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy crystal vase, and hurled it against the wall, the sound of shattering glass piercing the tense air. Emily recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment everything stopped. The silence was deafening, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Andrew stood frozen, his chest heaving, the realization of what he had done slowly sinking in. Emily stared at him, her tears falling freely now, her body trembling. "I'm sorry," Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible. But the damage was done. Emily turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door to their bedroom. The sound echoed through the house, leaving Andrew alone in the wreckage of their shattered life. The sound of sirens pierced the early morning air, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the Luster estate. Andrew stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, watching as uniformed officers and forensic teams swarmed the property. The shattered remnants of the previous night lay scattered across the floor, a silent testament to the storm that had erupted within these walls. "Mr. Luster," a voice called, pulling Andrew's attention. Detective Robert Manning stepped forward, his expression professional but sharp. "We need to ask you a few questions." Andrew nodded stiffly, stepping aside to allow the detective into the house. Manning's eyes swept the room, lingering on the broken vase and the overturned furniture. "Rough night?" Andrew swallowed hard. "We had an argument. Emily left." "And you don't know where she went?" Manning asked, his tone careful. "No," Andrew replied quickly, his voice faltering. "She said she needed some time. I assumed she'd come back." Manning's gaze was steady, his silence unnerving. "We received a call from a neighbor, Mrs. Garner. She reported hearing shouting and what sounded like breaking glass around midnight. Can you explain that?" Andrew hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. "It was just, the argument got heated. I broke a vase, but that's all it was." The detective didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured to a nearby officer. "Search the upstairs. Let me know if you find anything." As the officer disappeared up the staircase, Manning turned back to Andrew. "And you're certain you haven't heard from Emily since she left?" "Yes," Andrew said firmly. "I've called her, but she hasn't answered." Manning nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "Do you mind if we take a look at her phone records, just to confirm the timeline?" Andrew hesitated, but before he could answer, the officer upstairs called out, "Detective, you need to see this." Manning's expression darkened as he turned and headed up the stairs, leaving Andrew rooted to the spot. His heart pounded in his chest, every second stretching into an eternity. Moments later, Manning returned, his jaw set. In his hand was Emily's phone, its screen cracked but still functional. "We found this in the bedroom. Looks like she didn't take it with her." Andrew's breath caught. He hadn't even thought to check. "She must have forgotten it," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Manning's gaze was piercing. "That's one possibility. Or she didn't leave willingly." The words hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Manning said evenly. "But the pieces aren't adding up. A broken vase, a missing wife, a phone left behind. You can see why that raises questions." Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth, the messy, chaotic truth, threatened to spill over, but he held it back, clinging desperately to his fragile version of events. "We'll need to take you down to the station for further questioning," Manning said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. As Andrew followed the detective out of the house, he caught sight of Mrs. Garner watching from her front porch, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Her presence felt like a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The ride to the station was silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on Andrew like a physical force. He replayed the events of the night before in his mind, searching for the moment where everything had spiraled out of control. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way to rewrite the story. At the station, Manning led Andrew into a sterile interview room, its stark walls offering no comfort. "This is your chance to set the record straight," the detective said, his voice firm but not unkind. "If there's anything you're not telling us, now's the time." Andrew stared at the table, his hands trembling. The truth hovered on the tip of his tongue, but the fear of what it would mean kept him silent. And so the lies began to unravel, one thread at a time. Jake sat stiffly in the cramped interrogation room, his hands resting on the metal table. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows on the walls. Across from him, Detective Manning leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. "This isn't necessary," Jake began, his voice steady but strained. "I've already told you everything I know." Manning's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "I find that hard to believe, Mr. Daniels. A married woman goes missing and her phone suggests she was planning to escape Malibu. You're the one she was seeing. You really expect me to believe you know nothing?" Jake's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly. Emily wasn't planning anything. She was upset. She needed space. Space from her husband, Manning said, leaning forward. Space to be with you. Jake hesitated, his silence betraying more than he intended. Manning pressed on, his voice calm but firm. Let's not waste time here. If you cared about her, you'd want to help us figure out what happened. So tell me, when was the last time you saw Emily? Jake exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. 2 days ago, at the beach. Be specific, Manning said, his tone sharpening. What time? What did she say? It was late afternoon, Jake replied reluctantly. She said she felt trapped, that Andrew, her husband, was controlling, obsessive. She was scared of him. Manning's pen scratched across his notepad, the sound grating in the tense silence. Did she say anything about leaving him? Jake's hesitation returned, his mind racing. He could feel the detective's eyes boring into him, waiting for the slightest slip. She mentioned it once, but she wasn't serious. She just needed to clear her head. And what about you? Manning asked, his voice lower now, almost probing. Did you encourage her to leave him? No, Jake said quickly, his tone defensive. I told her to do what made her happy. That's all. Manning leaned back again, his gaze never wavering. And what makes you happy, Mr. Daniels? Being the other man? Or is it more than that? Did you think she'd leave him for you? Jake's face flushed, anger flaring in his eyes. That's not how it was. Then how was it? Manning challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you had plenty of motive to want Andrew out of the picture. Jake stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. I didn't want any of this. I didn't ask for her to come to me. I just wanted to help her. Manning remained calm, unfazed by Jake's outburst. Sit down, Mr. Daniels. Jake hesitated before sinking back into the chair, his breathing heavy. Manning let the silence stretch, the weight of it bearing down on Jake like a vice. Here's the thing, Manning said finally, his voice measured. If you're lying to me, I'll find out. And if you know something about Emily's disappearance that you're not telling me, it's only a matter of time before the truth comes out. Jake's shoulders slumped, defeat creeping into his posture. I'm not lying, he said quietly. I don't know where she is. Manning studied him for a moment longer before standing. We'll see. As the detective left the room, Jake buried his face in his hands. His mind replayed his last moments with Emily, the fear in her voice, the way she had clung to him as if he were her only lifeline. He hadn't known then that it would be the last time he'd see her, but now, sitting under the weight of suspicion, he couldn't help but wonder, had he failed her? Could he have done more? Outside the room, Manning conferred with another officer, his voice low but resolute. He's hiding something, Manning said. Keep digging. Jake remained alone in the room, the fluorescent light flickering above, his mind spiraling into doubt and regret. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the trial of Andrew Luster began. Spectators packed the gallery, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Reporters scribbled notes, their pens scratching against notepads, while the faint hum of whispered conversations filled the air. All eyes turned to Andrew as he entered, flanked by his legal team. He looked composed, yet the tightness in his jaw betrayed the storm brewing within. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lead prosecutor began, pacing before the jurors, this is not just a case of a man pushed too far. This is a case of obsession, control, and ultimately, a calculated act of violence. Andrew sat motionless, his gaze fixed forward, but his fingers tapped rhythmically against his thigh. He'd heard the accusations before, obsessive, controlling, but hearing them in a courtroom, amplified by the prosecutor's voice, made them feel more real, more suffocating. The prosecution's first witness was Mrs. Garner, her demeanor a mix of apprehension and resolve. I heard shouting that night, she testified, her voice trembling slightly. And then something broke. It sounded like a vase, maybe? I didn't want to assume, but it wasn't normal. The prosecutor pressed further. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the Lusters' relationship? Mrs. Garner hesitated, her gaze flicking to Andrew. They seemed distant. I sometimes saw Emily leaving late at night. She looked upset. Andrew's attorney quickly rose for cross-examination. Mrs. Garner, you claim you heard noises. Did you actually see anything that night? No, she admitted, her voice quieter. But Thank you, Mrs. Garner. No further questions. Next, the prosecution called Jake Daniels. Dressed in a crisp suit, he was almost unrecognizable from the carefree surf instructor Andrew had confronted weeks ago. Emily confided in me, Jake said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. She told me she was scared of Andrew, that she felt trapped. The prosecutor nodded. Did she ever say she planned to leave him? Yes, Jake replied, his voice firm. She wanted to start over. She just didn't know how. Andrew's attorney leaned forward, his expression calculated. Mr. Daniels, he began during cross-examination, you were involved with Mrs. Luster, correct? Jake's jaw tightened. We were friends. Friends? The attorney raised an eyebrow. Friends who texted late at night? Friends who took secret trips together? Jake's face reddened, but he held his ground. She needed someone to talk to. And yet you expect this court to believe you had no role in influencing her decisions? That you didn't encourage her to leave her husband? Jake's silence spoke volumes. The trial took a darker turn when the prosecution unveiled its most damning evidence. A voicemail from Emily to a friend, recorded days before her disappearance. Her voice, shaky but determined, filled the courtroom. I can't do this anymore. Andrew, he's not the man I married. I'm scared. The gallery erupted into murmurs, the weight of her words settling over the room like a heavy fog. Andrew's attorney objected, questioning the context of the message, but the damage was done. Finally, the prosecution brought forth forensic evidence. Photos of the crime scene flashed on the screen, shattered glass, blood spatter on the edge of the rug, and Emily's cracked phone found in the bedroom. The evidence tells a story, the prosecutor said, addressing the jury. And that story points to Andrew Luster. As the day drew to a close, Andrew's attorney requested a recess, citing the need to regroup after the emotional toll of the prosecution's case. The judge agreed, her gavel striking with finality. Andrew was led from the courtroom, his composure visibly fraying. The whispers of the gallery followed him, each word another crack in his carefully maintained facade. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what was at stake, not just his freedom, but the truth of who he was and what he had done. The courtroom was silent as the defense called its first key witness, a former maid who had worked for the Luster family during the early years of Andrew and Emily's marriage. Her demeanor was nervous, but her voice carried a quiet conviction as she took the stand. Can you describe the Luster household during the time you worked there? Andrew's attorney asked, his tone measured. It was tense, she began, her hands twisting together. At first they seemed happy, but after a while I noticed changes, arguments, Emily crying when she thought no one could see. The attorney nodded, carefully leading her forward. Did you ever witness Andrew behave violently toward Emily? Her hesitation was palpable, but she finally answered. Once. He grabbed her arm during an argument. It left a bruise. A ripple of whispers swept through the gallery, and Andrew's jaw tightened. His attorney quickly shifted the focus. Did Emily ever confide in you about her plans to leave? No, the maid replied. But she did seem unhappy. She told me she felt like she was living someone else's life. The prosecution wasted no time on cross-examination. You said you worked for the Lusters years ago. Isn't it true you haven't been in contact with them since? Yes, she admitted, her voice faltering. So, your testimony is based on memories from years ago, not the time leading up to Emily's disappearance? Yes, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his expression confident. Thank you, no further questions. The defense's next move was risky, calling Andrew to the stand. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as the weight of the courtroom's eyes bore down on him. He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and folded his hands in front of him. Mr. Luster, his attorney began, can you describe your marriage to Emily? Andrew hesitated, his gaze dropping momentarily before meeting his attorney's eyes. It was complicated. We loved each other, but we drifted. I made mistakes. I wasn't as present as I should have been. And on the night of her disappearance, Andrew's voice wavered. We argued. She wanted to leave. I didn't want her to go. Did you hurt her? The attorney asked bluntly. No, Andrew said firmly, his voice rising slightly. I didn't, the prosecution pounced. Mr. Luster, you've admitted to being controlling, even obsessive. Isn't it true that you couldn't stand the thought of Emily leaving you? Andrew's jaw clenched. I didn't want her to leave, but that doesn't mean I hurt her. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper. Isn't it true that you once told her, if I can't have you, no one will? Andrew froze. The silence in the room was deafening. The prosecution pressed on. Answer the question. I didn't mean it, Andrew said finally, his voice barely audible. The gallery erupted into murmurs once more, the tension thick enough to cut. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly, calling for order. As the day wore on, the final pieces of evidence were presented. Forensic experts testified about inconsistencies at the scene, blood spatter patterns that suggested more than a simple accident, fragments of Emily's belongings found in unlikely places. Each detail tightened the noose around Andrew's defense, but it was the final piece of evidence that delivered the most devastating blow. A letter, discovered among Emily's belongings, addressed to Jake but never sent. It was read aloud in court, Emily's voice brought to life through her own words. I thought I could fix this, but I can't. Andrew doesn't see me anymore, doesn't hear me. I want to leave, but I'm afraid of what he'll do. If anything happens to me, please know I tried. The letter was a bombshell, its implications undeniable. The prosecution rested its case with a sense of triumph, leaving the defense scrambling to salvage what little ground remained. Andrew sat frozen at the defendant's table, the weight of the letter crushing him. The truth, messy, painful, undeniable, was out, and there was no going back. The courtroom was quieter now, the tension that had filled the air for weeks beginning to fade. The final verdict was in, and Andrew Luster sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of resignation. The weight of the past few days crushed him. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to maintain his image. But now none of it mattered. His world had crumbled, and there was no longer any way to keep it together. The judge's voice rang out, pronouncing the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. It felt like time stopped. The room spun around Andrew as the words sank in. The reality of the situation hit him harder than any of the accusations ever could. The life he had built with Emily, the life they had once shared, was now just ashes. All of it was gone. Andrew's mind flashed back to that night, the argument, the anger, the desperate need to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. In his head, he had always thought he was doing the right thing, protecting his life, his love. But now, sitting in that courtroom, the truth was undeniable. He had lost control and in doing so had destroyed everything. The jury's eyes were on him, their expressions unreadable, but their verdict had already spoken volumes. They had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and made their judgment. There was no question left about his guilt. But in his heart, Andrew knew that there was more than what had been presented in the courtroom, something darker, more complex. He glanced at his lawyer, who avoided his gaze. No words were exchanged, but there didn't need to be. The legal battle was over. The court had spoken, and Andrew was left to face the consequences of his actions. There was no escaping them now. As the courtroom cleared out, Andrew's thoughts turned inward. He remembered the early days with Emily, how full of life she had been, how she had once made him feel invincible. He remembered the first time they had met, the way she had looked at him, and how he had fallen for her instantly. Back then, he had believed they were a perfect match. But now he could see the cracks that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Andrew's fingers tightened into fists at his sides as he sat alone in the cold, empty room. The trial had stripped away everything he had clung to. His wealth, his image, his reputation. None of it had mattered when it came down to the truth. And the truth was this. He had pushed Emily too far. He had let his own insecurities and fears control him, and in the end, it had driven her away. She had wanted to leave, to escape, but he had held on too tightly, and in doing so, had lost her forever. And now, in the silence of the empty courtroom, with the echoes of the trial still hanging in the air, Andrew faced the hardest truth of all. He had killed the woman he loved, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, and finally, with his own hands. The guilt was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing on his chest. He closed his eyes, imagining Emily's face one last time, the face that had once smiled at him with love, now replaced by the cold, empty silence of her absence. He had failed her in every way possible, and now there was no coming back from it. As the sound of footsteps approached, Andrew opened his eyes to see the guard standing at the door, waiting to escort him out. His trial was over. His fate was sealed. But as he rose to his feet and stepped forward, the reality of his actions hung over him like a dark cloud. There would be no redemption, no second chances. The door closed behind him, and the world outside felt distant, as though he were moving through a fog, disconnected from everything that had once mattered. The man who had once been Andrew Luster was gone, replaced by a man facing the consequences of his own choices. What do you think of Andrew Luster and his actions? Was he justified in his actions, or was his jealousy and control ultimately his downfall? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below.